We first met before we even did the pilot. That is how Dick Van Dyke once described meeting Mary Tyler Moore, the woman who would become one of the most important comedy partners of his entire career. She was younger than him, almost completely unknown, and had never played the kind of comedy role that would soon make her famous. He was already an established performer with a reputation for physical comedy, but neither of them could have known what was about to happen when they first walked into the same room. Within a remarkably short time, something clicked. Van Dyke later described Moore as sensational. He said the chemistry between them seemed almost accidental, as though the two performers had somehow discovered a rhythm that neither had to force. And that chemistry would become one of the defining partnerships in television history. But there is another reason their names are still connected more than 6 decades later. Because behind the laughter, the dancing, the perfectly timed glances, and the fictional marriage of Rob and Laura Petrie, Dick Van Dyke eventually admitted that he had developed a real crush on Mary Tyler Moore. That confession has been recycled countless times over the years. But the actual story is far more interesting than the headline. There was no secret Hollywood affair waiting to be exposed. There was no dramatic betrayal that remained hidden for 60 years. Instead, there were two enormously talented performers who developed genuine affection for each other while playing one of television's most believable married couples. And somehow, they managed to turn that complicated situation into something much more lasting. A friendship, a professional partnership, and a bond that survived long after their legendary sitcom ended. So what really happened between Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore? And why, even at 100 years old, does Van Dyke still talk about the woman who played his television wife? Let's go back to where it all began. Picture Los Angeles in 1961. Television was rapidly becoming the center of American entertainment, and CBS was preparing a new sitcom built around a young comedian named Dick Van Dyke. The show would eventually become The Dick Van Dyke Show. But before the cameras rolled, the producers needed someone who could play Rob Petrie's wife, Laura. The role went to a relatively young Mary Tyler Moore. At the time, she was nowhere near the television legend she would eventually become. She was still establishing herself as an actress, and comedy was not yet the defining part of her professional identity. Then she met Van Dyke. The contrast was obvious. Van Dyke was known for his energetic physical comedy. Moore brought elegance, timing, intelligence, and an almost effortless ability to react to whatever was happening around her. Together, they discovered something that cannot simply be written into a script. Timing. Real comedic timing. The Dick Van Dyke Show premiered in 1961 and ran until 1966. Van Dyke played Rob Petrie, a television comedy writer living with his wife Laura and their son Richie. Moore played Laura, and very quickly, audiences realized something unusual was happening. These characters didn't feel like the typical television husband and wife of the era. They felt like a real couple. They teased one another. They disagreed. They laughed at each other's mistakes. They had private jokes. And most importantly, they seemed completely comfortable around each other. That comfort became the secret weapon of the series. Audiences didn't have to be told that Rob and Laura loved each other. They could see it. A glance across the room could communicate more than an entire page of dialogue. A tiny pause could turn an ordinary line into a joke. And sometimes Van Dyke and Moore didn't even need dialogue. Their physical reactions were enough. That was the beginning of the mystery. Because when two actors make a fictional marriage look that real, people naturally start wondering how much of that connection exists when the cameras stop. And in this case, there really was something behind the scenes. Van Dyke eventually became surprisingly open about the fact that he had a crush on Mary Tyler Moore. But the word matters. A crush. Not an affair. Not a secret relationship. Not some hidden romance that suddenly came out decades later. A crush. He described the feeling almost like something a teenager might experience. The problem was that he was an adult working with the same woman 5 days a week, playing her husband in front of millions of viewers. And according to Van Dyke, the two had a serious problem. They couldn't stop laughing. There were times when they would get the giggles during filming, making it difficult to finish a scene. That might sound like a small detail. It wasn't. Comedy depends on control. Actors have to know exactly when to speak, when to pause, when to react, and when to remain completely serious. One person laughing at the wrong moment can ruin an entire take. But Van Dyke and Moore apparently had a chemistry that sometimes made maintaining that control difficult. The laughter itself became part of the connection. They understood each other's rhythm. They could anticipate a reaction. They knew when the other performer was about to break. And according to Van Dyke, there was even a point when a psychiatrist helped him understand what was happening. He had a crush on his co-star. Sometimes another person has to tell you something that everyone else already knows. And for Van Dyke, the realization appears to have been both amusing and uncomfortable. Because there was an important complication. They weren't two single actors casually exploring a new romance. They were both married. And that changes the entire story. This is where the popular version of the story often becomes misleading. People hear the words Dick Van Dyke had a crush on Mary Tyler Moore, and immediately imagine an affair. But the evidence doesn't support that version. The attraction and affection were real. The affair wasn't. For years, the two continued working together while maintaining their separate personal lives. They played husband and wife on television while remaining committed to other relationships away from the cameras. And that required something Hollywood doesn't always get enough credit for. Restraint. Think about the environment they were working in. They weren't spending a few hours together once a week. They were working intensely on a major television production. They had rehearsals. They had filming. They had writers and directors around them. They performed intimate scenes. They made each other laugh. They became increasingly comfortable with one another. And millions of people were watching them behave like a married couple. Under those circumstances, developing feelings would not be particularly surprising. What mattered was what they did with those feelings. And by the accounts available, they didn't turn the attraction into a secret relationship. They kept the boundary. That distinction is important because it changes the story from a scandal into something much more human. Two people can care deeply about each other without turning that affection into an affair. Two people can have chemistry without becoming romantic partners. And two actors can create an unforgettable fictional marriage without secretly living one themselves. In fact, their decision may have helped preserve the partnership. Because once the series ended, there was no dramatic breakup to deal with. There was no secret relationship collapsing. There was no public betrayal. There was simply a friendship that could continue. And it did. The story becomes even more interesting because Mary Tyler Moore also spoke about the connection between them. She didn't describe some secret romance that Van Dyke had invented years later. Instead, her own recollections supported the idea that their chemistry was unusually strong. That matters. Because when a story about two celebrities is repeated for decades, details can become exaggerated. A friendly relationship becomes a romance. A crush becomes an affair. A funny moment becomes a secret confession. But in this case, the central story remained remarkably consistent. They had chemistry. They cared about each other. They worked exceptionally well together. And they didn't have an affair. Van Dyke later described their connection as almost instinctive. He said they became something like an improvisational team, able to anticipate each other's thoughts and reactions. CBS also reported that Van Dyke described working with Moore as almost like going to a party every morning. That tells you more about their relationship than a sensational headline ever could. He wasn't simply saying that she was attractive. He was talking about the joy of working with her. That distinction is crucial. The strongest professional relationships are not always built around romance. Sometimes they come from admiration. Sometimes from trust. Sometimes from discovering that another person makes you better at what you do. And that appears to be exactly what happened with Van Dyke and Moore. So why did Rob and Laura Petrie feel so real? Part of the answer was writing. But writing alone cannot create the kind of chemistry audiences saw between them. The actors had to understand each other's timing. Van Dyke was a master of physical comedy. He could stumble, dance, fall, move across a room, or turn an ordinary gesture into a punchline. Moore could match that energy without copying it. She knew when to react. She knew when to stay still. And sometimes her expression was funnier than anything she could have said. Van Dyke later praised her comedic instincts. He understood that she wasn't simply standing beside him while he performed. She was participating in the comedy. They were building jokes together. CBS reported Van Dyke describing their chemistry as something that happened almost by accident, and he said they eventually became an improvisational team. That is one of the biggest reasons the episodes continue to work. The comedy isn't simply one performer delivering jokes while another waits for a cue. It feels like two people responding to each other. And that feeling is incredibly difficult to manufacture. It is also why audiences began to assume there must be something romantic behind the scenes. But there was another explanation. They were simply exceptionally good together. Sometimes that is enough. The Dick Van Dyke Show ended in 1966. Normally that might have been the end. The actors would move on. The crew would separate. The audience would eventually find another show. But Van Dyke and Moore didn't simply become two former co-stars who occasionally exchanged polite greetings. Their relationship continued. And one fascinating example came only a few years later. In 1969, the two reunited for a television variety special called Dick Van Dyke and the Other Woman. The title itself played on their famous partnership. But the reunion wasn't simply an attempt to recreate an old sitcom. It demonstrated that their chemistry still worked even after the original series had ended. PBS notes that the success of that special helped lead CBS toward giving Moore her own series. That is a remarkable detail because it connects their first partnership directly to the next major chapter of Moore's career. And that next chapter would change television. When people talk about Mary Tyler Moore, it is easy to remember her only as Laura Petrie. But that role was just the beginning. After the Dick Van Dyke Show, Moore eventually became the star of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. This time she wasn't playing someone's wife. She was playing Mary Richards, an independent working woman building a career in television. The character became one of the most important female television figures of the 1970s. The series tackled subjects that many television shows had previously avoided or treated very carefully, including work, relationships, divorce, sex, birth control, career independence, and the challenges of being a single professional woman. Moore's performance earned widespread recognition and helped establish her as a television icon in her own right. CBS notes that her performance as Laura Petrie had already earned her 2 Emmys before she moved into the role of Mary Richards. That evolution matters because it proves something about her relationship with Van Dyke. She didn't need to remain his television wife. She became a major star independently. And Van Dyke's career continued in its own direction as well. Their partnership wasn't successful because one depended on the other. It was successful because both performers were extraordinary. Over the decades, their careers moved in completely different directions. Van Dyke continued working in television, film, theater, and music. Moore became one of the most respected actresses in television and film. Their lives changed. Their careers changed. Their personal circumstances changed. Their personal circumstances changed. But their affection for each other remained. That is arguably more impressive than the original chemistry. Because chemistry can happen quickly. Friendship requires maintenance. It requires time. It requires forgiveness. It requires people to keep choosing the relationship even when life becomes complicated. And that's what makes their story unusual. They didn't need to work together every week to remain connected. They didn't need another hit show. They didn't need to appear together constantly. Their friendship survived the end of the series. It survived changing careers. It survived decades. And when Mary Tyler Moore died in January 2017, Van Dyke spoke about her with extraordinary affection. He didn't talk about her as a forgotten co-star from another era. He talked about her as someone who had fundamentally shaped his life and career. He praised her talent and her comedic instincts. He remembered the connection they had shared. And he made it clear how much she meant to him. CBS reported that Van Dyke called her the best there ever was, and remembered how naturally they worked together. That kind of statement carries weight when it comes from someone who had worked with some of the greatest performers in entertainment history. But there was something else hidden inside his grief. He wasn't mourning the end of a romance. He was mourning the loss of a friend. Mary Tyler Moore's death brought the old questions back. Was their chemistry real? Did they love each other? Was there ever something more? The simplest answer is that their affection was real. But real affection doesn't automatically equal a romantic relationship. The two had shared an extraordinary period of their lives. They had been young performers together. They had become famous together. They had learned comedy together. They had created characters that millions of people loved. And they had remained friends for decades afterward. That kind of bond can be difficult to define. It doesn't have to fit neatly into the categories of husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, or co-star. Sometimes a person simply becomes part of the story of your life. And Mary Tyler Moore was clearly part of Van Dyke's story. Then came another remarkable chapter. Dick Van Dyke reached his 100th birthday in December 2025. Very few entertainers have enjoyed careers long enough to reach that milestone while remaining recognizable to multiple generations. Van Dyke's career stretches across almost 8 decades. He became famous in television. He worked in film. He performed on Broadway. He sang. He danced. He received major awards. And even after decades in show business, he continued making appearances and finding ways to entertain audiences. His centennial year naturally brought renewed attention to his life and career. And once again Mary Tyler Moore's name appeared. That shouldn't be surprising. Because if you tell the story of Dick Van Dyke's career, you eventually reach 1961. And when you reach 1961, Mary Tyler Moore is standing beside him. The Television Academy has preserved extensive interviews with Van Dyke discussing both the initial chemistry he had with Moore and his relationship with her, showing just how important that partnership remained in his recollections. That is perhaps the most powerful part of this entire story. He doesn't talk about her because he needs another headline. He talks about her because she was there near the beginning. She was part of the years that helped define him. And 6 decades later, she remained part of the way he remembered his own life. Today, celebrity relationships are often measured by scandal. Who dated whom? Who broke up? Who cheated? Who secretly hooked up? Who was caught? But the story of Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore offers something different. Two people can have genuine chemistry without becoming lovers. Two people can have feelings without destroying their existing relationships. Two people can be extremely close without their friendship needing a scandal attached to it. And perhaps most importantly, two people can create something beautiful together without needing to possess each other. That's what Rob and Laura Petrie represented. Their fictional marriage worked because Van Dyke and Moore trusted each other. Their real friendship survived because they respected boundaries. And their legacy endured because the connection was based on more than attraction. It was based on admiration. It was based on professional respect. And it was based on the simple joy of making each other laugh. More than half a century after the Dick Van Dyke Show ended, new generations continue discovering it. That is not an accident. Many older sitcoms become historical curiosities. Some are remembered mainly because they were popular at the time. But certain shows survive because the performances remain genuinely funny. The Dick Van Dyke Show is one of those shows. And Rob and Laura remain one of television's most recognizable fictional couples. Their relationship helped establish a model for sitcom marriages that felt warmer, more playful, and more human. They weren't perfect. They weren't constantly romantic. They weren't written as some fantasy couple who never disagreed. They were funny. They were affectionate. They annoyed each other. They supported each other. They lived an ordinary life that somehow became extraordinary television. And a huge part of that success came from the two people playing them. Van Dyke and Moore didn't simply memorize dialogue. They listened to each other. They reacted to each other. They gave each other room to perform. And they understood that the funniest moments often happen between the lines. That's why the chemistry still feels natural. That's why audiences still believe in Rob and Laura. And that's why the real-life story behind them continues to fascinate people. So, did Dick Van Dyke have feelings for Mary Tyler Moore? Yes. By his own accounts, he had a crush on her. Did they have extraordinary chemistry? Absolutely. Did Mary recognize that special connection? Her own recollections and their long history together support the idea that she understood just how unusual their partnership was. Did they have a secret affair? There is no reliable evidence establishing one. And that's the important distinction. The real story doesn't need an invented scandal. The truth is already fascinating. A young actress walked into an audition in 1961. A comedian who was already becoming a star met her. They were paired together. They discovered an almost effortless comedic rhythm. They became television's Rob and Laura Petrie. One developed a crush on the other. They kept their boundaries. They continued working together. They remained friends after the show ended. They reunited years later. Their careers continued separately. And when Mary Tyler Moore died in 2017, Dick Van Dyke remembered her not as a secret lover, but as one of the most important people he had ever worked with. Then, decades after their first meeting, he reached 100 years old. And her name was still part of the story. Maybe that's the real ending. Not a scandal. Not a secret. Not a forbidden romance. But a friendship that lasted longer than most Hollywood careers. A professional partnership that changed television. And two performers who discovered that sometimes the strongest connection you can have with another person doesn't need to become a romance to become permanent. Mary Tyler Moore helped Dick Van Dyke create some of the most memorable television of his life. Dick Van Dyke helped introduce the world to a performer who would eventually become a television pioneer in her own right. They made each other better. They made audiences laugh. And somewhere between the rehearsals, the giggles, the missed takes, the perfectly timed glances, and the thousands of hours spent pretending to be husband and wife, they built something real. Friendship. That is why, more than 60 years later, people are still talking about them. And maybe that's why Dick Van Dyke still brings up Mary Tyler Moore. Because some people aren't simply part of your career. They're part of the story you tell about your life. And for Dick Van Dyke, Mary Tyler Moore will always be part of that story. If you enjoy honest stories about classic Hollywood, legendary television stars, and the relationships behind the most famous shows ever made, subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments which classic television partnership you want us to uncover next. because sometimes the real story behind the screen is even better than the one we watched on television.